Check out this tweet that showed up in my time hop the other day. 6 years ago, I was working on my master's degree, and I'd figured out on the one hand an 80 on this final means an A in the class, on the other hand a 10 will get me a B. So this is something that can be really helpful when you're going into your final exam to know where you stand, how much it's going to affect your grade, and there's a really easy way to figure it out, and we can do that together right now if you want to. So I'd like to call this How to Succeed Without Really Trying, or How to Calculate What You Need on Your Final Exam to get the grade you want in the class. In order for us to figure this out, you'll need to know your current grade in the class, you'll need to know how much your final exam is worth, and you'll need a calculator most likely, because this math is probably going to be a little tricky to do by hand. Not that you can't, just I wouldn't want to if it were me. If you don't have a calculator handy, or if the only calculator you have is your phone calculator, but you have a computer with internet access, you should go over to Desmos.com and use their calculator, because it's super duper helpful, because you can write things out, and I'll show you how you can do that so that it'll be easy peasy. If you're not actually interested in this next part where I show you how this all works, then you can skip ahead a little bit in the video and see what the actual numbers are that you need to work with. Let's say that you've figured out that your final is worth 20% of your grade. So what that means is that right now 80% of your grade is made up of your current grade. And the reason that's helpful is because if we take our 20% final and we add it to our 80% grade, then that gives us our grade in the class at the end of the day. So what we can do is change these to decimals, because that's what you have to do in equations, and then we can use some rearranging. And so if you're in Algebra 1 or above, if you're ever like, why would we ever need to rearrange formulas, this is a reason why, because there's a specific thing we're trying to get to, and it's not the thing that's solved for right now. We want to figure out how our current grade and the grade we want in our class can get us what we need on the final. So we actually want to solve for our final exam grade. So we start by making these decimals. So 20% is 0.20. I'm going to label this as F for final exam. We're going to change the 80% to 0.8, and we'll use C for current grade, and then that's going to equal G for our grade in the class. Now, in order for us to make these nicer numbers than decimals, we could multiply everything by the same thing, and in this case it helps to think about what these are as fractions. 20% is actually a fifth of our grade, and 80% is 4/5 of our grade. And so that's actually what shows us what we can multiply by to get rid of these fractions, which is 5/1. So our final exam plus 4 times our current grade equals 5 times the grade we want in our class. So then we finally subtract over the 4C, and we get this handy dandy formula. This formula is specifically for if you have a 20% final. I want to say that that's probably one of the most common ones you would come across. A 20% final exam, the formula you can use is 5 times the grade you want in the class. Okay, so instead of using a variable, I'm actually writing it out there to make it really plain and simple what you plug in there. So 5 times the grade you want minus 4 times your current grade. And so here's some situations that we might decide to use. Let's say that we want an A. So really the grade we want is at least an 89.5. if all we want is an A in general, we don't care if it's an A minus or an A or an A plus, we just want that letter that starts with an A as opposed to a B, then we could put in 89.5. That's the lowest possible grade that rounds up to an A. And then from there, we just need to think about our current grade. Maybe you've been doing really, really well, and you have like a 95. Well, if you work this out, you're going to get a surprisingly awesome result, I think, of what it is you need on the final in order to keep your A. Whereas maybe you're shooting for an A, but you have not done so well all semester. And so maybe your current grade right now is a 72. This formula then will give you what it will take on the final exam for you to actually end up being able to do this. So, appearing as if from nowhere, a small selection of Desmos.com. So when you go to Desmos, you click Start Graphing. Yes, you can use this to graph lines and parabolas and anything else that you know how to type in, but if you just type in a math problem into this little typing area, it'll actually work it out for you. So if we do this first one where we're shooting for an A and we have a 95, and the times buttons are pressing Shift 8 for the little asterisk key. Okay, so in order for our person with a 95 to maintain their A in the class, they need a 67.5. Now, fortunately, if you've been making a 95 in a class, there's a really good chance that you'll make at least a 67.5 and keep your A. If you decide that you really, really need to feel better about yourself, though, let's say you drop this down and you're like, I just want to pass the class, so I'm happy as long as I get a C or above. Well, in that case, you'd have to make lower than a negative 32.5 in order to lose your A if you're starting with a 95. That is silly, right? Obviously, you're not going to make a negative score. For the most part, that's impossible. So what this can do is, if you've got a current grade that's really good, this can help you feel better about your chances. Let's look at this other situation though. Let's change this back to 89.5 and let's put in our person that has a 72 and is still holding out hope for an A. This says 159.5. Maybe you are able to do a ton of extra credit on the test and 159.5 is possible. More likely than not though, that is aiming too high. And so, you know what, honestly, it's good to be realistic. If you've got a 72, if you thought you had a chance to make an A, now that dream's already been squashed. So you can go into the test more realistically. What about a B? Is that doable? 109.5 is certainly better than 159, but still doesn't look good unless there's some sort of extra credit, or some teachers will take your final and replace your lowest test grade, so that could be helpful. There's other things that teachers will sometimes do at the end of a class that could affect your grade. So if you absolutely ace the test, hey, maybe that's possible. But you know what? Let's just see. To keep our C, we would need to get at least a 59.5. So we, as a 72 grade student, need to not do much worse than what we've been doing, right? This is essentially a 60. We've been making an average of 72. So we've got to bring it to we've got to at least get us around a 70 would be helpful to make sure that we keep our C. So that's if we have a 20% final. Let's look at some other final percentages to see what those look like. Here we have it all in one place. So the 20% final, which we just did, which is 5 times the grade you want minus 4 times your current grade. I've also, though, got listed here 10% final, 15% final, and 25% final. Yes, it's possible your final could be worth something else, but most of the time it's something nice. And that 15% final is quite difficult. Not difficult, it's different, right? Because we've got fractions that are unresolved in there. and that's because 15 doesn't actually divide into 100 evenly. So if you do have a 15% final, definitely use Desmos to figure that out. You can make fractions. It's really awesome so that you can calculate it. And some last thoughts, like if you're doing this, it is helpful to think, what do I need to get to maintain the grade I have, whether it be an A or a B or a C? What does it take to get the next grade up, if that's an option? What does it take to end up with a grade lower? And what that can do for you is it can give you some hope in some cases. Like, it's a really nice feeling to know that even if you bomb your test, that you'll still be okay in the class. So it can give you hope depending on your grade situation. Or it can give you motivation. If you really need a 70 to keep whatever your grade is, well, you're going to spend more time on that than if you just need a 10, right? So it can give you motivation. It can also just help you have a realistic idea of how these grades interact. It can be really tricky as you've gone through the semester, if you have access to an online grade book, which I think most people do these days, that you see your grade change daily or weekly or whatever. Sometimes it can seem like daunting, the idea of figuring out what each grade is worth, and in a lot of ways it is. But here we have something that we can actually figure out. How is this going to affect my grade? And so I think that's a neat thing to be able to go into it seeing. It is funny to put in stuff and be like, haha, I have to get 150% or on this to get an A, or haha, I would have to get a negative 5,000 in order to make a 0 in this class. That is fun to do. By all means, go for it. But more importantly is having a realistic idea of what you can do and what you should strive for. One of the schools I worked at had all 20% finals. And so 20% is enough to affect your grade quite a bit, either in the positive or the negative way. The majority of people, in my and many other teachers' experiences, the majority of people will make on their final exam something very similar to what they've been making on tests the rest of the semester. And this is especially true with math. I'm a math teacher, obviously. So if you are trying to go in and make a higher grade than you normally do, I'm not saying that's impossible. I've seen it happen. I've seen somebody make a 100% on their math final when they had not made anywhere near that on any of the other tests before that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's not super likely, unless you are able to really do something differently in the way that you study or prepare for the test. That's definitely something you need to keep in mind, is if you have been consistently making or even inconsistently making certain grades on your tests and quizzes, you're not all of a sudden going to be able to do something better without changing your approach. So use this formula to, figure out, what do I need on the low side? What do I need on the higher side? And then think about, especially depending on how many finals you have, think through how much time you want to devote to each and that sort of thing. Like, if it's going to take you a 100% to get an A in a class, whereas as long as you make a 70, you'll maintain your B, whereas you've got another class where it's possible to bump that letter grade up, well, that should show you where maybe you need to focus more time studying on to make it, worth it. Sometimes we get B's in class or C's or whatever it is, and that might not feel nice, and in fact can be incredibly frustrating. So you've got to decide, okay, am I gonna put in the time and really try to knock this out of the park, if that's a possibility, or is my time better spent elsewhere? And I don't mean on video games. Not until after your final exams are done. You person right there, I'm talking to you. You know who you are. Oh wait, is this a mirror? I was talking to myself. No video games till everything's graded. Okay, that sounds great. I'm glad we had this talk. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I'm so impressed you made it all the way to the end. I mean, that's really an achievement. This video was longer than it had to be, so good job, way to go. And as a reward, I get to ask you to subscribe and like my video, give me a comment, tell me what you need to make an A in the class, especially if it's hilarious, or tell me what you need to make in order to fail, because that's also hilarious. Let me know what happens when you use the formula. I can't wait to see the results. And if you are into social media, you can follow me on Twitter, and I have a new Instagram. Both are at CaseDevMath. It's actually pronounced K-Steve. There's just not a second E that makes that obvious. So that's fun and interesting and quirky. Thanks so much.